Hi everybody, my name's Tia Parks, and today I'm going to go over the basics of the skull with you. So first we'll break the skull down into two divisions. This upper portion here is known as the neurocranium. It's what protects and covers your brain. Then this inferior portion here that you see separated is the viscerocranium, and it's otherwise known as the facial bones. So first we'll start off with the neurocranium. Again, it's what protects and covers your brain. It has 8 bones that comprise it. The first one here, this yellow one, is the frontal bone. Next we have the parietal bone, which comes into 2 bones. We have the temporal bone in this orange portion. Again, that's another 2-bone area. And then we have the occipital bone. Here is the most posterior portion of it. We have this pink portion, the sphenoid, and then the red portion there is the ethmoid bone. And as we go through the slides, we'll break each one of these down. First we have the occipital bone. Again, it is the most posterior portion of the skull. We'll just go around the horn here and name off some features of it. Here we have the occipital condyle, which connects to the atlas bone. Next we have this large hole, it's the foramen magnum, where the spinal cord passes through there, and then a portion of the spinal accessory nerve. Next we have the superior nuchal line, which is this little indention here. Next the inferior nuchal line, and then another main feature of the occipital bone is the external occipital protuberance. Next we have the temporal bone, which is on each lateral side of the skull. We have a squamous portion here, the zygomatic process, where it attaches to the zygomatic bone, the mandibular fossa, where the mandible comes up and attaches there. The styloid process is that pointy feature there. The external auditory meatus is here, and that's otherwise known as your ear canal. And then finally here we have the mastoid process. Next we have the parietal bone. This makes up the superior portion of the skull here, and there's one on each side again, just like the temporal bone has one on each side. It's pretty simple. Here we have the parietal tuberosity. You see that going down the superior temporal line, which goes right there at the top, and then the inferior temporal line there, right here towards the bottom. Next we have the frontal bone, which is the most anterior portion of the skull. It makes up your forehead area. We'll start off here at the supraorbital foramen. It's otherwise known as the supraorbital notch. Next, right here in the center, we have the glabella. Next, we have the zygomatic process, which attaches to the zygomatic bone. And as you see names like this, zygomatic, temporal, anything like that, I hope you'll catch on that that signifies that what bone it connects to in this area. Next, we have the nasal spine, and then we have the orbital plate here. So next, we have the sphenoid bone. This one is very different from the rest. It looks really odd. You can imagine it looking somewhat like a butterfly. It's more on the inner portion of the skull. Here you see the greater wing, and then the smaller portion here is the lesser wing. Circular area is the body. Then here we have the superior orbital fissure. It's a really important area. It has several cranial nerves that pass through there, and the blood supply of the eye also passes through there. Now we have the foramen rotundum, the lateral pterygoid plate, the medial pterygoid plate, the pterygoid hamulus, and then the pterygoid canal. Next we have the ethmoid bone. It's another odd looking bone. It's posterior to the nasal bone and anterior to the sphenoid bone. Two main features of the ethmoid here are the cribriform plate and the crista galli. Next we have these ethmoid sinuses, which are these holes here, and the orbital plate, and then finally the perpendicular plate there. Next we have the viscerocranium, which again are the facial bones. You see here we have the nasal bone, this pink portion, this aqua blue color is the lacrimal bone, the red portion is the palatine bone, this purplish blue color here, the septum-like feature, is the vomer, this lime green color is the inferior nasal concha, this large yellow portion is the maxilla, these green cheek portions are the zygomatic bone, and then finally the large purple jaw-like feature here are the mandible. We'll start off with the nasal bone. It's a really simple bone. You can see it's not labeled here. It has its lateral borders and then its inferior borders. But again, it is really simple, so there's not a whole lot to it. And you know by its name, the nasal bone, where it's located and what it might look like. Next we have the maxilla bone that forms the upper portion of the mouth. You can't see it from here, but you can see it in the top right corner here. These small little holes that are on each side, those are known as the infraorbital foramen. So we'll go around the horn again, just like the other bones. We have the frontal process. the maxillary sinus, which is the largest sinus, and then we have the palatine process, and then the alveolar process here. Next we have the zygomatic bone, and again those are the cheek-like features of the skull. So we have the frontal process here, the infraorbital margin, the zygomaticofacial foramen, and then the temporal process there. Next we have the inferior nasal concha bone. This is here inside the meatus of the nose. It's the only concha that has a bone, so remember that. The inferior portion is the only one with a bone. You can see here the portions of it where it touches the maxilla, the lacrimal bone, the ethmoid, and then the palatine bone. Next we have the lacrimal bone. It's posterior to the nasal bone, and just like the nasal bone, it's fairly simple. Here we can see the anterior border, and then the inferior border. Now we have the vomer, which is known as the plow-shaped bone inside the nose. On each side it has an ala, and then it has its vertical plate. Next we have the palatine bone, which you'll see for the most part where it's attached to the maxilla, and where it forms with the maxilla the upper roof of the mouth. So here we see the vertical plate, the orbital process, the maxillary process, and then the horizontal plate. Next we have the mandible bone, and again that's that jaw portion of the skull. Here we have the posterior condyle, which attaches to the temporal bone. Then we have the mandibular notch here, and then we have the coronoid process that attaches to the zygomatic bone. Here below the teeth is the alveolar process. This large L-shaped portion here, or I should say the lower half of the L-shaped bone, is the body. And the whole here is the mental foramen. Here's the angle of the mandible, and then finally this whole portion here is the ramus. So finally I'll go over a few important foramen of the skull. These are really important as we see that some arteries, some veins, and then the cranial nerves also pass through these holes. Here we first have the carotid canal, and that one's an easy one to remember. It has the internal carotid artery that passes through it. Next we have the stylomastoid foramen, which has cranial nerve number 7, with the facial nerve that passes through. Next, the largest hole, which we saw on the occipital slide, is the foramen magnum. It has the spinal cord, the vertebral arteries, and the spinal accessory nerve roots passing through it. And next we have the jugular foramen. It has 4 big features going through it. It has the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, the spinal accessory nerve, and then the internal jugular vein. And all of those pass through that one hole. Next we have the hypoglossal canal, and again, like the carotid canal, it's pretty easy to remember what passes through it, considering the name. The hypoglossal nerve is the one that passes through there. Next we have the really small hole here. It's the foramen spinosum, and the middle meningeal artery is what passes through it. Finally we have the foramen ovale, and the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve passes through there. So I hope that was helpful, and here's a picture of me. Maybe I'll make another video.